He who is not free to choose his own actions is not worthy to be called a man. So in this video we now look at another one of Immanuel Kant's contributions to ethics, namely his idea of the autonomy of the will. So let's begin with, what do we mean by the term autonomy? Well, it's composed of two parts: the prefix auto, which means self, and nomos, which means rule or law. So autonomy simply means self-rule or self-governance. An autonomous being is one that is capable of governing itself, of making decisions about its own life based on its own rational nature. Kant thought that only rational beings could be truly free because they alone can set their own goals and pursue them in accordance with their own wills. For Kant, humans are rational beings and therefore they are free. However, he did not think that animals are free because they are not rational. Of course, nowadays there are some scientists that would contest that claim, particularly those in the field of animal cognition. But I don't think they would contest Kant's view that rationality is necessary for freedom. So if autonomy is the ability to make your own decisions based on your rational nature, then what does it mean for the will to be autonomous? What Kant is suggesting is that the will should be free from external influences when making decisions. That is, the will should not be coerced into making certain decisions. It should be able to decide freely whether or not to follow certain desires or inclinations. We have to keep in mind here that Kant was very influenced by the rationalist tradition, by thinkers such as Descartes. And according to rationalism, reason is the highest faculty of the mind. It is more important than our emotions, our desires, and our senses. And so when it comes to making decisions, we ought to follow our rational nature, which means that we ought to decide based on reason and not on our desires. Now, for Kant, autonomy doesn't just apply to our decision-making, but it applies to our whole lives. Our entire way of life should be governed by our rational nature. And so for Kant, living an autonomous life is the same thing as living a moral life. In order to live an autonomous life, we must be able to determine our own ends or goals and also the means to achieve them. Now, determining our own goals is quite straightforward. All we need to do is reflect on what we want to achieve and then make plans to bring about that end. But determining the means to an end is a little bit trickier, especially if our goal involves other people. How do we know which means are acceptable and which are not? Which actions are permissible and which are not? Well, Kant's answer to this question is that we can determine which means are permissible by appealing to our reason. He believed that there are certain universal principles that govern human conduct, and these principles can be discovered through reason. They are not based on our desires, our intuitions, or any other feelings. Rather, they are based solely on our rational nature. For example, you might come across someone in your life who wants to borrow money from you. You say no because you don't want to lend them any money, so you decline their request. But what if they ask you again and again and again, and eventually you give in and you lend them the money? Are you being autonomous in this case? Are you being moral? I think the answer is no. Why? Because your initial decision was based on your desire, namely the desire not to lend money. And although they kept asking you, it seems like you were just being stubborn rather than acting according to your rational nature. Your desire prevented you from lending them the money even though rationally you knew that you should. So what makes you different from someone who acts according to their desires all the time, or someone who has no autonomy at all? And so the idea of the autonomy of the will suggests that we ought to always act according to principles determined by our rational nature. According to Kant, we can discover these principles by using our rational capacities to think about how we ought to treat others. If we use our imagination to think about all the different ways we could possibly interact with other people, and then we reflect on what our rational nature tells us about these interactions, we will come up with universal principles that apply in all situations. For example, we might conclude that killing innocent people is wrong, stealing is wrong, and lying is wrong. These principles do not depend on our desires or preferences. They are grounded in our rational nature. But why should we care about following these principles? Why shouldn't we just do whatever we feel like doing? Well, according to Kant, we should care about following these principles because they are the only type of principles that we could ever rationally will to be universal. Let me explain this. Suppose you want everyone in the world to be as happy as possible. Now you might think that this is a good maxim, but Kant would say it's not a rational one because it depends on your desires and preferences. What if someone else wants everyone in the world to be as miserable as possible? Would it be rational for them to will that their desire be universalized? No, it wouldn't. It would be irrational. Now consider the principle, don't kill innocent people. This principle doesn't depend on anyone's desires or preferences. It's based solely on our rational nature. and so it's a rational principle. And if it were universalized, it would still be a good principle. In fact, all the rational principles that we can think of would be good if they were universalized. That is why Kant says that we can rationally will any particular rational principle to be universalized. But we can't do that with any irrational principles, because those principles would become bad once they were universalized. For example, imagine a world where everyone steals whenever they feel like it. Stealing would no longer be possible. So now you might be thinking, great, we know that we ought to act autonomously, namely according to our rational nature, and that we ought to act according to maxims that are universalizable. That is, maxims that can be rationally willed to be universal. But what if my desires conflict with these maxims? What if I desire to steal or to lie, but I know that these desires are not in accordance with my rational nature, or that they cannot be universalized? What should I do in this case? Well, according as Kant, this is precisely where the concept of duty comes in. Duty is what we ought to do when our desires conflict with what our rational nature tells us we ought to do. Let's take the example of telling a lie. Imagine that your friend asks you, "Do you have a girlfriend?" And you respond, "Yes, I do," even though you're not in a relationship. In this situation, you probably think it's fine to tell a lie because it doesn't really hurt anyone. It's a white lie, so to speak. But if you were to universalize this maxim, that is, if everyone were to tell lies whenever they wanted to, society would fall apart. And so Kant would say that even though it may seem like it is fine to tell this particular lie, it's not fine in general. It's not a universalizable maxim, and so you have a duty to tell the truth even when it would be easier to lie. In summary, Kant's theory of the autonomy of the will says that we ought to act according to our rational nature. That is, we ought to act according to maxims that are universalizable. That is, maxims that can be rationally willed to be universal. And if our desires conflict with these maxims, we have a duty to act in accordance with our rational nature, even if it goes against our desires. So what do you think of Kant's idea of the autonomy of the will? Do you think it provides us with a good theory of morality? If so, why? If not, why not? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you really enjoyed it, then consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. The principle of autonomy of the will is one of Immanuel Kant's most profound contributions to moral philosophy, forming the backbone of his vision of freedom and ethics. In Kant's framework, autonomy means that the will is self-legislating, yet gives itself the moral law, rather than being governed by external influences, desires, or imposed rules. To be autonomous is to act according to laws that reason itself recognizes as universally valid, not because of fear, reward, habit, or social pressure, but because we see them as right in themselves. Kant contrasts autonomy with heteronomy, which occurs when our actions are dictated by something outside of pure reason, such as personal inclinations, cultural norms, authority figures, or even divine commands when they are accepted uncritically. In heteronomy, the will is not truly free. It is being pushed or pulled by forces other than the moral law rising from our rational nature. Autonomy, by contrast, is the condition of genuine moral freedom. We obey the moral law not because we are forced, but because we will it as rational beings.